I thought I would present a scheme which is somewhat Platonic or even Whiteheadian, in the sense that it requires a consideration of questions of scale and integration in the definition of life, so that we can decide whether or not to cut off the occurrence of consciousness, let's say, with the occurrence of life, whether or not there is such a thing as a biotic and abiotic division that would correspond to a division in consciousness, or whether or not we could just expand that definition using some sort of a Whiteheadian framework that relies on hierarchies. To do this, I want to show some of the things around us here that differ in scale and complexity, and talk about whether or not they are conscious, because this is one of the things that Whitehead specifically avoided in his discussion, was the specificity. He didn't give any examples of his ingression of eternal objects into actual entities. He specifically avoided that, and I'm going to specifically give examples of it here, because one of the things that you miss when you don't give specific examples is the opportunity to correct your theoretical stance with the examination of an actual entity that, to some degree, according to him, the ingression is indeterminate, that there's a gradient, but to some degree it acts as a corrective to the overall scheme, because you can see that it's not just a monolithic entity that we call either life or consciousness, but as Whitehead himself said, that it's a network, a nexus, or concrescence of actual entities, a grouping of them, which have to be integrated in order to show the characteristics of consciousness that we consider to be characteristic of humans. And when we look at other entities that don't have those same levels of integration, we are unable to recognize whether consciousness is there or not. So it's the scale of the observation that determines whether or not, A, we say that something is alive, or B, whether or not we can identify the consciousness. Now I'm going to have to take the camera off of the tripod that it's sitting on over there, and I want to show you the forest where we're at. It's a beautiful forest here. It's actually a coastal rainforest, and this is, if I didn't say the date, this is April 2nd, 2011. We're surrounded by some big hemlock trees here. It's a hemlock forest. There's some spruce. There's a little bit of snow on the ground. It's a nice day. It might look cold, but it's actually in the low 30s here. So let me get the camera off of the tripod. This is the bark of a hemlock, this striated bark, longitudinally creased, running up the tree. These trees are 100 to, the big ones are maybe 150 feet tall. And you might say that they're big. Of course, then there's plenty of other things on these trees. For example, right here, we have a little lichen. The sporophyte, or the spores on those, the spore capsules on those lichens, are tiny. I need a magnifying glass to show them to you, actually. And the spores are even tinier. And yet, both of these are living creatures. So these living creatures exist at different scales. And size doesn't really matter. It's the level of integration that matters. If you have a Whiteheadian scheme, you have to consider the abstractive hierarchy, as he said. And the abstractive hierarchy, to jump into a Platonic definition, to give it a little bit more definition than he actually did, the Platonic hierarchy is based on a Pythagorean scheme that requires a tripartite soul. In other words, there's three levels that are required to be integrated in order to form a complete being. Now, I don't think that's controversial in Plato, that you would be able to find that very easily. If you want to talk about what's alive, then you have to talk about the level at which it exists. Now, if we were to, let's say, take some of these smaller organisms here. Now these are, I'm going to have to look away from the camera for a second. Okay, so these are small mosses here, and these little plants here are a type of a blueberry, actually. So these little plants here are what you might call vegetative, right? They're vegetative. These mosses over here are vegetative. everything here that we can see that's big enough for us to see is actually vegetative, since I'm not in front of the camera anymore. So all of these are operating at what would be, in the Platonic sense, the lowest level. These are the vegetative soul. To go up to the next highest level in that triad, you get to the appetitive or desiring soul, or you might call the emotional level, and that corresponds to the existence of animal hungers and drives and feelings. So in that sense, this entire area here is vegetative, right? So the question then is, if it's only vegetative, would it be correct to take one of these trees and to call it an individual? I mean, how can it be integrated with the upper levels if it doesn't possess them within its own organism? So the question then isn't really whether or not this tree is alive. Most people would say, well, sure, it's alive. But they don't know right offhand what organism it's a part of. Is it an entity unto itself? Where is its higher soul? And is it even on this planet? Is it the sun? What drives the pulmonary system of this tree? Isn't it the gradients in temperature and moisture that are provided by the sun? So these entities, all of them, these vegetative forms, are all at the lowest level, and taken as a whole, they are not even an individual. They are part of a vastly larger individual, and we can't even identify what it is. We don't know what it's, the ego in terms of the organizing principle of its organic form would even be. Is it the solar system or something even larger? We don't know. But these trees are certainly components of that at least planetary system and can't be thought of as individuals. Now, on the other hand, if we were to take one of these small, there's my gloves, if we were to take one of these small mosses, we would find the same thing. We would have to look inside of them and isolate individual cells. And we could walk between those cells if we were small enough. We could be like an oxygen molecule, and we would be walking just like this. We'd be walking through the membrane of that of the plasma membrane of that cell, and we would see off to the side, oh well, here's a big macromolecule. You know, it's got a lot of proteins, and here's another one. It's a big conglomerate with some starch molecules. Maybe there's a vacuole there. Here's some integral membrane molecules over here, the big proteins that might be transporters between the atmosphere and the below ground environment. So what we have here, we're inside of a cell now. We're the size of an oxygen atom, and everything around us looks like another molecule to us. So it's not alive. It's not alive because we're below the level at which it's integrated. We're down at the level where we're just looking at sticks and stones, and we say these things are not alive. And if I were to pull a rock out of the ground here, which I'm not even going to try to do since it's all frozen, but if I would show you a rock, you'd say, no, that's not alive. And my answer, based on what I've been saying about all of this stuff, is that the question isn't whether or not it's alive. Everything is alive. You just have to identify the organism of which it's a part, and then ask the question, to what degree is that organism integrated? I think I've at least put the bare bones of the argument out there that you can't talk about consciousness and you can't talk about life without talking about the level of integration. And the level of integration of a society, which would be an organism, the level of integration depends on how complex the internal components are and what their interactions are. That is to say, it has to have that there's an internal psychism in the sense of Desjardins, that there's an interiority developed because of the density and intensity of interior connections is what integrates it, and that's what makes it conscious. Now, the question that Professoranton is asking is, well, is consciousness a necessity in the universe, or the cosmos, I guess, to use the ordering principle there? And the answer is, it depends on the level of complexity and the degree to which it's integrated, whether or not that consciousness is recognizable as consciousness. Now, if you want to get apple juice out of the mill, what do you put in it? Apples, right? Yes. So how do you get consciousness out of something? This is what modern science has been trying to do, and it's never succeeded. Neuroscientists, neurobiologists, and so forth have not actually even come close. There's no such thing as a spiritual machine. The idea of emergence is like, sprinkle it with a little pixie dust and call it emergence, and we're presto, we take something that's not alive and that's not conscious, and now it is. Well, obviously that's impossible. If you want to get apple juice, you got to start with apples. So, is it true that consciousness must have been there from the very beginning? The answer is obviously yes. Yes, it must have been there from the very beginning. Could we recognize it as such? It depends on the scale and the level of integration. The more similar it is to us, the more we recognize it. And then the question might arise, well, then if that's the case, it sounds like what you're saying is that everything is conscious and everything is alive. Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. Everything's conscious and everything is alive, but you won't be able to recognize it any more than a liver cell is going to be able to recognize that you're a graduate student working towards your degree and that your girlfriend has blonde hair. No. What are the chances? So what are the chances of us being able to identify the organism of which this is a functioning component? Pretty slim, right? This is not a scientific explanation. There's no reason to appeal to science for something that's essentially a metaphysical question.